Hey, what's going on, guys? So in this video, I want to compare the top lending and borrowing protocols and see which one is safer and how I'm moving forward when investing into DeFi with the recent scams and stuff like that. So I'll be covering quite a few protocols here and kind of give you my thoughts behind it. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages with these protocols? And it's really hard to say which protocols are going to be safer at the end of the day, but I will try my best to break down like what the design difference is, and you could decide for yourself which protocols you want to use, or you could just spread out your funds, buy some insurance like what I would be doing moving forward. So let's dive right in and pull up DeFi Llama. And like always, this is not meant to be financial advice. Please do your own research before deploying any capital. I'll be covering some of these protocols that have more total value lock, stuff like Aave, Morpho, SparkLend. I'm going to be skipping just Lend because it is on Tron and most of the total value locked is on Tron, and some other protocols like Maple, which is mainly for institutional borrowers, and Venus protocol as well, because most of the total value lock is on Binance Smart Chain. So if we start from Aave, we saw the total value lock drop all the way from about like 25 billion to around 14, 15 billion, right? So they did lose about $10 billion in total value lock, which is pretty significant from the recent restake ETH hack. So if you don't know what happened and you want to get more into detail, just check out my previous video. Basically, Restake ETH got hacked and the attacker was able to acquire a bunch of Restake ETH that was not backed by anything. And then they deposit on lending and borrowing platforms like Aave, then borrow different assets out like ETH so that they could take the money and run. And if you go to the Ethereum market right now, you can see the utilization is still at 100%. So if you lent out your ETH, your capital is still stuck there. You're not able to withdraw unless you're swapping directly from Aave WETH into ETH. Then you still need to wait here. But the good thing is Stanny and a few other DeFi protocols are coming together to raise the funds to minimize the effects on those people that lent out their assets. And one thing that this exploit taught us is that there's a big weakness with these lending and borrowing markets because a lot of these collateral assets are pulled together. And if there's a major exploit on one of these assets, like for example, this OS ETH or stuff like LBTC, TBTC, if they're able to use these assets as a collateral asset, technically, if one of these assets are hacked and they're not freezing the specific asset on the market in time, the attackers could then use these as collateral and then borrow out other assets, right? And with Aave, we are exposed to more collateral assets, which in my opinion, increase the surface area for attacks. So if again, one of these assets get hacked, then potentially there could be more bad debt on the protocol, right? So moving forward, I would not be depositing too much funds onto the Aave V3 platform just because of that reason. And on top of the collateral asset risk that you are taking, you're also at a higher risk if you're using these smaller layer 1 networks and these other layer 2 networks because they're typically much more centralized and the risk of exploit is going to be more as well. But thankfully on Aave, there is an umbrella module as well. So if you were depositing on ETH mainnet and there's a loss that was incurred, the amount of asset that is being staked in the safety module would cover some of the losses, right? So that is a benefit of using Aave V3. But at the same time, because of the recent hack, again, we are going to be exposed to more risk if these assets do get hacked. So that is the downside. And let's take a look at Aave V4 too. There's only about like 30 something million in total value lock. So this is supposed to change like the market from having a bunch of different layer 1, layer 2 markets into liquidity hubs. So these are called hubs, and to be able to borrow assets, then we are going to be interacting with spokes. And if you read here, spokes are modules that manage specific supply and borrowing use cases, asset types, or risk profiles. So we are interacting directly with spokes, and this allows Aave to also limit the risk as well for like a particular market. In theory, they could limit the risk to that spoke so that they could not just tap into the entire liquidity. The risk is somewhat controlled by the settings of the spoke itself, right? If you go to Aave version 4 and let's just say we pick USDC, and if we scroll down, these are basically the different spokes, right? For example, on the core liquidity hub, you can see the blue chip spoke. You can see here for this particular blue chip market, these are only the supported collateral, right? So you can't really use a bunch of exotic assets to borrow against the asset. And in theory, this should be safer. Aave V4 is also newer and less tested than the V3, right? But yeah, in theory, this should be safer. And I personally would be much more comfortable having exposure to these assets when I am trying to borrow some USDC rather than potentially risking some of my assets because of these more exotic stables or more exotic ETH, more exotic BTC, right? And Aave does have a bug bounty on the V4 protocol as well with 500K. And I believe this is for the V3 version. They do have a max bounty of $1 million for Aave. So I think using Aave is still a viable option. I'm still kind of waiting to see V4 if there's any problems with it. And with V3, there is that risk of, again, like these other collateral assets getting hacked. And then there's a bank run on Aave. And if you're not awake during the first few hours, maybe your liquidity is going to be stuck there. And if there's some bad debt that is not covered by the umbrella module, then you could potentially suffer some losses, right? So that is something to keep in mind. And it's going to be true for some of these other protocols as well that I'll be diving deeper into. And the second biggest lending and borrowing protocol right now is Morpho. And you can see that the total value lock is still relatively flat after the Aave hack. And I think Morpho does have a pretty good design with their lending and borrowing market. And it is pretty different from a lot of these other lending and borrowing platform. So the first thing that we could do on Morpho is to supply our USDC or our assets into these different vaults. These vaults are being managed by these curators. You are giving up control and you do need to trust these curators to manage the funds well. I personally don't like to use these vaults simply because I don't want my money to be managed by a curator. I would personally like to deploy and control my assets myself. So if you are using the vault function, in my opinion, it is exposing you to more risk. But if our goal is maybe to just borrow some USDC against our asset, maybe it's the Coinbase Bitcoin. And I think the Morpho Coinbase Bitcoin liquidation threshold is also a bit higher than Aave as well. So if we go back to Aave and go to Coinbase Bitcoin, you can see that on Aave V3, you would be liquidated at about 78%. But on Morpho, you will have some extra room at 86 something percent. And you can see also that these markets are being deployed by which curators and the amount of it and the size of the market here. So the largest market on Morpho is actually on Base because Coinbase actually uses Morpho in its lending and borrowing products. If you're borrowing against your crypto through the Coinbase app, you're actually using Morpho. And if you want to directly interact with Morpho, you could do so, right? And if you don't want to stay on Base, then we could go for the ETH mainnet market. I personally prefer ETH mainnet market. The liquidity is less than Aave V3. If we go back to Aave V3, you can see that there's about like 900 something million worth of Coinbase Bitcoin on Aave. The liquidity on Morpho is less, but it is enough for most use cases. And one big advantage of Morpho over Aave is that each market is isolated, meaning that the risks are contained within each individual market. So if you're lending out your Coinbase Bitcoin as collateral and then you're borrowing USDC against it, you're not actually exposed to other assets beside USDC and Coinbase Bitcoin, right? You don't have to actually be exposed to these other exotic ETH or exotic BTC. So you are going to have a lower risk in theory as long as the smart contract is safe, right? And the contracts are immutable, they can't be changed after deployment, and it will keep persisting as long as the blockchain is live. But the market is permissionless as well, meaning that a lot of people could create their own market. So you do need to be careful in which markets you do deposit in because anybody could deploy a market. And if you're not careful, then you could be deploying into the bad ones, right? But if you're sticking with the top ones, then you should be reasonably secure. So with the restake ETH incident, I really like the isolated markets, but at the same time, there are some drawbacks. Like for example, if I do deposit Coinbase Bitcoin to borrow some USDC, then I am forced to use Coinbase Bitcoin as the collateral. So if price of Bitcoin drops and I only hold ETH on the side, I might have to sell my ETH for more Coinbase Bitcoin to supply as collateral if I want to increase my liquidation buffer and I don't want to be liquidated, right? So there are some limitations and some drawbacks with it, but I think it is better in terms of risk management to have isolated market with at least a portion of your lending and borrowing strategies so that you could reduce the risk of getting exposed to those other hacks and scams. And they do have a $2.5 million of bug bounty. So that is great to see as well. And then the next protocol that we're going to look at is SparkLend. And Spark did had a huge jump in the total value lock after the Aave hack. I think some of the larger wallets did move some to Spark. That's why we saw a huge jump. And SparkLend is pretty similar to Aave in its design. You can see that there's a lot of different collateral assets, but at the same time, they're not exposed to as many assets as Aave. They did have some restake ETH here, and then there's also some more exotic ETH, and then also Bitcoin, but they've been frozen. And you can check here with the status of each asset if it could be used as collateral or if it could be supplied, it could be borrowed. And one unique thing that I want to say about Spark is that you cannot use stablecoins as collateral. So if you're trying to lend out stablecoins and then borrow some crypto asset to short the crypto asset, you can't really do that on Spark. But that also means that if one of these stablecoins get hacked or depegged, you are also not exposed to the risk of these stablecoins, right? So if you look at the list is pretty small compared to Aave. So SparkLend is also another great choice in my opinion if you want to diversify your lending and borrowing risk. And there is a bug bounty here of $5 million on Spark as well. So I think that's a great sign that they are taking their security more seriously. And the next protocol that we want to look at is compound finance. And a lot of these protocols are actually having the similar designs as Aave. So there's not too much to dive into besides like the small differences. And you are going to be exposed to that same risk of like these different assets getting hacked, like restake ETH, and maybe there's a potential bank run on these DeFi protocols, right? And with Compound, I do want to point out that back in 2021, there was a hack that was worth about like $147 million on Compound. And since then, the total value lock has kind of just been flat for Compound. But this is just another DeFi protocol that you could consider spreading your assets into. I personally would probably just skip Compound just because the risk profile is probably pretty similar to Aave in terms of the collateral that they accept. And there's also that history of being hacked. So if you plan to use Compound and you're trying to borrow some stable coins, you are going to have to deposit one of these assets to be able to borrow. If one of these assets do get hacked, there could be potentially some bad debt on the protocol. And if there's a bank run, your funds could be stuck there as well. So they are exposed to a bit more assets compared to SparkLend. So I would just personally use SparkLend in this case, but they do have a $1 million bug bounty as well. And if you are on Solana, then the two main option becomes Camino Lend and Jupiter Lend. So if we look at Camino and I want to borrow against my Solana, again, they are suffering the same problem that Aave has, which is that the main market has a bunch of these assets that could potentially be hacked. And if someone was able to do that and they supply it on the main market and then they could be borrowing some other assets out, that could become the similar situation with Aave as well, right? But it's just another platform that you could consider using if you want to diversify your risk exposure. Because with the restake ETH exploit, we did see that multiple protocols did have some exposure to restake ETH, but at the same time, not every protocol got affected equally, right? So there is a benefit to actually diversifying your funds. And one neat thing right now with Camino is that I think there is points for these X stocks assets. So if you want to hold some tokenized stocks, then you could use these assets as collateral, borrow some USDC against it if you want. And if you are using these X stocks, you are going to have some incentives here if you borrow USDC with a net borrowing rate of only about 2.5 to 3%. And it also allows us to use Coinbase Bitcoin here if you don't mind exposure to the X stocks market, right? So it could be helpful to diversify your risk. Camino also has a 1.5 million bug bounty as well. But Camino has been around for quite a while, and I think they haven't had a problem yet. And it's just another platform to consider. I personally prefer like doing most of my lending and borrowing on EVM chains. But if you are using a lot of DeFi on Solana, then you're probably using Camino already. And Jupiter Land is also another option. It is powered by Fluid. And from what I could gather in the docs, it seems to be using a similar system as Aave V4, where they are having a liquidity layer, and then you're able to tap into that liquidity layer with the individual markets, right? And I'm not 100% sure which protocol is actually going to be safer at the end of the day. We never actually know that, but you can see that you could be depositing your Solana and borrow some USDC against it. And these other assets are supported as well, like Coinbase Bitcoin. If you want to use more lending and borrowing protocol, the best way to protect ourselves is actually to diversify across different protocols. And number two is to buy some insurance whenever you can, right? I think Nexus Mutual only covers EVM chain, and that's also why I personally don't prefer holding too much assets on Solana. Aave technically by itself did not get hacked, but one of these assets got hacked, which affected the entire protocol as well as a lot of these other DeFi protocols, right? In my opinion, it is more likely that one of these more exotic assets get hacked in the future rather than the protocol itself. And even some of these asset wrappers that are technically safe, we never know if that is actually going to be the case or not. Because if the hack happens and they're not fast enough to freeze the funds, which typically they're not going to be fast enough to freeze everything, then it's just going to be the same situation with Restake ETH, where they could use that as collateral and borrow a bunch of assets before these markets can be frozen, right? So I think it's important to not put everything into DeFi or into large protocols, even ones that have been around for years. And it is helpful to have some allocation to DEXs directly as well if you are yield farming liquidity pools like I am, versus just putting too much capital into lending and borrowing platforms. And of course, some spot holdings as well. And if you want to learn more about DeFi, then check out the link down below. You could join our DeFi community and get access to our courses and software and stuff like that. If you want to learn more about anything else, leave a comment down below. If I think that is going to help more people out, I'm more than happy to make these videos. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys on the next one.